So let's take a close look at the basic structures and functions of plant parts. When you're talking about plant structures, a fantastic place to start is with flowers. These happen to be lily flowers, and they're beautiful. But flowers come in all kinds of shapes, colors, sizes, and designs. But the one thing that they all have in common, and if you look very closely you'll see them, are male and female parts. Those male and female parts are what make fertilization possible for flowering plants. And that's the first step in creating new baby plants. So flowers are an extremely important plant structure. You might recognize this plant as rhubarb. Rhubarb is delicious, but it's also a great example of a plant stem. The delicious edible part of the rhubarb is the stem, and its primary function is to support the upper part of the plant. In the case of rhubarb, it has huge leaves. Now you don't want to eat these because they're poisonous, but the stem, which is delicious, does a great job of supporting these big leaves. But there's another purpose for the stem, and that is moving water and nutrients from the bottom of the plant up to the leaves. So there's two purposes to stems. One is support for the upper part of the plant, and two, for moving water and nutrients up from the ground. Rhubarb stems, very useful and very delicious. I'm up here in a cherry tree to talk about two important related structures of plants, fruit and seeds. Now this is an Evans cherry tree. Might be surprised that cherry trees grow in Alberta, but they do. And the Evans cherry has some delicious cherries. Now, that's one of the functions of fruit in plants, is to attract animals and birds in order to eat the seeds and potentially spread them to other areas. Now that brings us to the seed, which is an amazing structure in plants because so much is packed into such a tiny package. Inside the seed is an embryo and the food necessary for the embryo to survive. If this seed lands in good soil, it will germinate and produce a whole new plant. So fruit and seeds are very important plant structures for spreading new plants. I'm hiding in this dogwood tree to talk about two important plant structures, trunks and branches. The primary purpose of trunks and branches is support. This is a small tree, but it still needs a very strong trunk in order to support the whole rest of the tree. The branches serve the same function. Many other branches, leaves, fruits, flowers, all need to be supported by the branches. There's also new growth that shoots from the branches and the trunk. So, branches and trunks are very important support structures for plants. So what we have here is a pretty amazing example of roots, a very important plant structure. If you took this spruce tree and dug up the roots and flipped it upside down, you would see this. And you could see that these roots are spreading all over the place. A spruce tree sends roots in many different directions. And that's because roots are responsible for a couple of important things. One is that the roots provide strong base structure for the plant. That way, with the roots firmly embedded in the soil, the tree is very, very stable. The second thing that roots do is, as they spread around, they draw in moisture and nutrients. So roots are very responsible for feeding the whole tree with water and the nutrients that it needs to live. So roots are a very important plant structure. They provide support, and they also provide a network to draw in water and nutrients for the plant. So I'm right next to this larch tree to talk about another plant structure, cones. Cones are found on cone-bearing trees, and what's interesting about them is there are male cones and female cones. Male cones, and you may have noticed this by accident one day if you ever bumped into a pine tree and it released a whole cloud of powder. That's the male cones releasing pollen, and that pollen floats through the air and it lands on female cones. The female cones tend to be bigger and sticky, so the pollen sticks to the female cones, and that's how fertilization takes place. So cones are a very important reproductive structure in cone-bearing plants. A couple of other interesting features about cones is that they are at different stages of maturity, often on the same tree. For instance, this larch has an immature cone here that's just growing. All the scales are closed. It's not ready yet. But this cone is fully mature. And what you'll see in most of these cones is two different types of scales. One are protective scales, and then other scales actually have a seed at the bottom. And it's those seeds that will fall out, and if they fall into soil, they will germinate into a new plant. They also are a tasty treat for many animals, and birds will stick their bills in and pick the seeds out. Or you might just see a squirrel chowing down on a cone such as this, because if it can strip all the protective scales, there are lots of delicious seeds inside. So cones, a very important reproductive plant structure. So I'm here amongst a real mixture of plants to talk about one of the most important plant structures of them all, and that's the leaf. The leaf comes in so many different shapes and sizes. For instance, here's the classic leaf shape that you see on something like an apple tree, but there's also so many other interesting leaf shapes. For instance, here's a multi-lobed leaf of a bleeding heart plant. There are also long and thin leaves like this leaf of a lily. There are beautifully round-shaped and almost perfectly symmetrical leaves like this lady's mantle plant. And there's also even needle-shaped leaves like the needles of a pine tree. But the one thing that these leaves all have in common is a very important function, or functions, of breathing and giving off water. Now, how does a leaf breathe? Well, a leaf has pores in it, and it's with those pores that the leaf is able to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen, which is extremely important for performing the process of photosynthesis, which is how the plant makes food for itself. Now, at the same time, the leaf, through those pores, also gives off water, and that's called transpiration. Now, that's extremely important because as a leaf transpires and that water leaves the leaf, it creates a whole chain reaction of water being drawn down the branches and stems, and then up through the trunk, and then up through the ground. So a leaf giving off water, evaporating from the pores of the leaf, is really the engine for the plant bringing water all the way from the ground up through its whole structure and spreading water everywhere. So leaves, an extremely important plant structure for both breathing for the plant and for transpiring, moving water. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the basic plant structures and functions. As you explore plants in the future, take a close look and see if you can spot those basic structures and think about their functions. You never know what you might discover.